also see that Tim Hancock is still listed as a member, even though he is no longer mayor. Typically, the bylaws require that an individual serve until replaced by the council. He is your appointment. You can replace him when you're ready to replace him. He is currently the vice president, and because the president was recalled, he is our chief executive officer, chief administrative officer, however you would want to call it. We have a prospect today that is reviewing a performance agreement. We expect to get it back from them at some point in time if their lawyers ever let it go. And it will require execution by KEDC, and Mr. Hancock will execute that document, if not replaced, because according to our bylaws, he's the fellow who should do that. So you've got some decisions to make about that. We'll also put in here a board of directors job description that we developed in concert with our members. If any of you are feeling like you want to do this, you can take a look at that and see what's required. The next section, section 8, contains some of our financial reports that I'll mention to you briefly. First, you see a balance sheet, and you see our assets and our liabilities laid out there. The next page is a budget. We prepare an annual budget for KEDC. And in this particular budget, if you go to the bottom, you'll see that we will operate at a $297,592 deficit this year. That is because we anticipate more expenses than we have revenue. And the question becomes, how do you pay that? We have a reserve fund, like all economic development organizations, and we calculate that regularly for our members because they need that information. They need to know how much money they have that is unobligated that they can encumber on projects. And today, that reserve amount stands at roughly $3,726,707. We do have two fairly significant deals in the works that will require some of that funding. 3, actually. So that's kind of the financials and the way it flows. You can look at the budget and get a feel for income. And you can see City of Killeen funding. This year is $912,717. That amount flows out of the governing documents. That is not a request that KEDC makes to the council. That is a number that is determined by the city staff based on the formula included in the governing documents. And we literally do not know what that number is going to be until someone from the staff tells us, or the first quarterly check shows up, and then we scramble and revise. You can see we also have some additional revenue. We charge rent to occupy our buildings. That money is plowed back into KEDC projects. We pay some tenant fees and they reimburse us for that. There's a little interest, although not very much. And there's also a note receivable with Shiloh that goes back to that deal that I told you about earlier. They have 2 more payments left of that deal. Then you get down to the expense portion of it. You see unpaid incentives for Blackboard student services. The way that works is when we enter into an agreement with a company and we legally obligate ourselves, we enter that as an expense. Typically, KEDC deals when we're paying incentives, job creation incentives, we'll pay half of it up front and we'll make them earn the other half. In that full-time job, 12 months, totally full over that 12-month period, you can collect the second half of that job creation pay. In the case of Blackboard, they have never met that standard. They've never demonstrated to us, so we haven't paid them. And that contract is 5 years long. If they don't achieve that by the end of that contract, that $625,000 becomes unencumbered and goes back into KEDC for other uses. But that is a requirement that the company has to meet. You see a couple of other incidental things like a membership in the Gulf Coast Strategic Highways Group. You see the HOTDA contract. That's now $109,000 a year. You see insurance. We have to provide insurance not only our property but for our members, directors and officers liability insurance. We have some expenses related to our park and our buildings. You see those allocated there, and repairs and maintenance and those kinds of things. Legal fees and accounting, we do an annual audit of KEDC. The three organizations that we are responsible for, KIF, KEDC, and GKCC, all of the books are segregated, and each organization is audited independently. We put out the bids, and the directors who drive those organizations select the auditor for that process. On the second page, you see some miscellaneous things. You see item 5010, airport marketing. KEDC provided an amount up to $300,000 for airport passenger marketing in this last year. Some of that money has been called on in the next financial reports. That amount will be reduced. You see the A&M Scholarship Fund. You see the Mounted Warfare Foundation. That is 1 year of funding for them, and then other expenses. That's the KEDC budget. Item 9 is recently recruited audit of KEDC accounts. We wanted you to have a copy of that. Item 10 is the promissory note, and then we got a map of the Killeen business part. So that's the KEDC story. As near as I can tell, that's how it came about, and that's how it's operating. I'll be glad to answer any questions about KEDC.
When did you say the KIF was formed? In 1950?
1950. Information I have is 1950. I was a very young lad at the time there, so I couldn't be sure of that. But that's.
What are your questions for Mr. Crutchfield? And Mr. Clark?
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Crutchfield. In section 2, bullet number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, KEDC is funded wholly by the City of Killeen. The funding is determined by city staff based on a formula contained in the ordinance. Funding is approved on an annual basis by the City of Killeen Council as part of the city's budget process. I don't see in the historical documents how we're funding you, but I do know that in November of 2010, a previous council approved 2% of the ad valorem taxes to be used to fund KEDC, and in last year's budget, 1 penny represented a little bit more than $750,000. I don't think my mic's working.
It is.
It is?
From my perspective.
Okay. So that was a deposit of $1.55 million into KEDC last year. That would be nice if that historical document was inside our packet.
I'm not sure I follow your point. That's a staff function. Okay, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah.
2 cents of the tax rate last year would have been $912,000, I believe. Was that number?
Of course, our budget is $946.
Correct. It is a formula of 2 cents. We'll have that. I believe you have the document, the budget document. We can bring that back and look through that.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
Did he answer your question? Or he will answer your question?
Yeah, he answered.
He knows what he's doing.
He knows what he's doing. November 2010.
Okay. What are your other questions for Mr. Crutchfield? Any questions? Thank you very much. That was a very thorough briefing. Appreciate it very much. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Good. Okay. That's part 1. If you got time, we'll do part 2.
Part 2.
Part 2 has to do with, you also have a contract for economic development services with the Greater Killeen Chamber of Commerce. And I can do that now, Glenn, or I can come back and do it later. You tell me how you want to do it. Colonel Perry sitting back here, I get the feeling breathing down my back.
You're on a roll. I say.
Okay. We'll give you a similar book for the chamber. And again, I want to emphasize that none of the money that we just talked about that KEDC utilizes comes to the Chamber of Commerce. We have a separate contract with the city of Killeen, and have since came here, to provide economic development services. And this document really kind of lays out what those services are, and it